The lecture hall fell silent as Commander Kethfor stepped onto the platform, his 6 legs clicking against the polished floor. Rows of young Zephyrian cadets watched with eager anticipation, their crystalline eyes reflecting the ambient light. This was the moment they had been waiting for, a chance to hear from the most decorated veteran of the human wars. Kethfor's carapace bore the scars of countless battles, deep grooves where human projectiles had found their mark. His mandibles clicked nervously as he surveyed the audience. These younglings had grown up in peacetime, their understanding of warfare shaped by sanitized textbooks and holographic simulations. They had no idea what they were about to hear. "You have come here expecting glory stories," Kethfor began, his voice resonating through the chamber's acoustic amplifiers. "Tales of Zephyrian superiority, of how our advanced technology and tactical brilliance overwhelmed a primitive species. I am here to tell you something different, something that will disturb your sleep for cycles to come." A murmur rippled through the audience. The cadets shifted uncomfortably in their seated positions, their confidence already beginning to waver. 40 standard years ago, when humanity first appeared on our sensor arrays, our intelligence division dismissed them as insignificant. A young species barely 3 centuries into their industrial age. Their weapons were crude kinetic projectiles and chemical explosives. Their ships were slow, clunky vessels that belched exhaust and required constant maintenance. By every metric we used to measure military capability, they should have been conquered within a solar rotation. Kethfor's eyes grew distant, lost in memories that time had failed to diminish. "I was a young tactical officer then, assigned to the 3rd Expeditionary Fleet. Our mission was simple: establish dominance over the human colonies, extract their resources, and integrate the survivors into our labor force. Standard pacification protocol. We had done it successfully to 17 other species." The commander's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing the cadets to lean forward. "The first engagement took place near their colony world of New Geneva. Our fleet of 60 vessels approached their defensive perimeter with confidence. They had 12 ships, outdated frigates, and a single heavy cruiser that looked like it belonged in a museum. Our tactical computers calculated a 99.7% probability of victory within 6 standard hours." Kethfor paused, his mandibles clicking in what humans might recognize as bitter laughter. The battle lasted 3 days. When the debris finally settled, 37 of our ships were either destroyed or disabled. The humans lost 9 vessels, but somehow, impossibly, they had achieved tactical victory. They retreated in good order, having accomplished their objective of buying time for civilian evacuations. The cadets exchanged bewildered glances. This was not the story they had expected to hear. Their military doctrine taught that superior technology and numerical advantage guaranteed success. The idea that a primitive species could outfight the mighty Zephyrian fleet was almost incomprehensible. "How?" One young cadet finally found the courage to ask. "How did they defeat superior forces with inferior equipment?" Kethfor's eyes fixed on the questioner with laser intensity. "That, young one, is the question that haunted our command structure for the entire duration of the war. The answer is not pleasant, and it challenges everything we thought we knew about warfare, about civilization, and about the nature of intelligence itself." The commander activated a holographic display, showing tactical readouts from that first disastrous engagement. Red dots representing Zephyrian forces moved in perfect formation, following textbook battle patterns. Blue dots representing human vessels moved in seemingly chaotic patterns, breaking every rule of engagement the aliens had ever studied. "Watch this sequence," Kethfor instructed, highlighting a section of the battle. Our flagship, the Eternal Victory, had sustained minor damage to its forward shields. Standard tactical doctrine called for it to withdraw to the rear of the formation for repairs. The humans somehow detected this vulnerability within minutes and concentrated their entire fleet's firepower on that single weak point. The hologram showed the human ships abandoning their defensive positions, leaving their flanks exposed as they swarmed toward the damaged Zephyrian flagship like predators sensing wounded prey. "This should have been suicide," Kethfor continued. "They were exposing themselves to devastating crossfire from our remaining vessels. Our tactical computers predicted their destruction within minutes. But the humans had calculated something our computers couldn't process. They understood that sometimes winning requires accepting catastrophic losses. The room was completely silent now, the earlier excitement replaced by growing unease. These cadets had been raised in a culture that valued preservation of resources above all else. The idea of deliberately sacrificing valuable assets for strategic gain was alien to their thinking. 3 of their frigates were destroyed in the assault, Kethfor said quietly. But their sacrifice enabled the remaining ships to cripple our flagship and scatter our formation. In a single decisive moment, they had turned our numerical advantage into a liability. Our ships, designed to fight in coordinated formations, became confused and ineffective when their command structure collapsed. The commander's next words sent chills through every cadet in the room. And that was just their opening move. Kethfor manipulated the holographic controls, bringing up a new tactical display. This one showed a star system map with multiple planets and asteroid fields marked in various colors. The cadets could see trade routes, mining stations, and defensive installations spread across the region. 6 months after the New Geneva incident, High Command decided that our initial approach had been too conservative. They deployed the 5th and 7th combined fleets, over 200 ships, to crush human resistance in the Kepler 442 system. This time there would be no mistakes. We would demonstrate the full might of the Zephyrian Empire. The display zoomed in on the primary inhabited world, showing massive orbital platforms and surface installations. Kepler 442b was heavily fortified. Our intelligence indicated that the humans had spent decades building underground bunkers, surface-to-orbit defense batteries, and a network of automated defense satellites. Standard siege warfare suggested a 6-month campaign to reduce their defenses systematically. Kethfor's carapace darkened, a physiological response that indicated deep emotional distress. The humans evacuated the entire planet in 72 hours. Confused murmurs arose from the audience. One cadet raised a claw. "Commander, surely our blockade prevented any significant evacuation?" "You would think so," Kethfor replied grimly. "Our ships controlled every major space lane. Our sensors monitored every vessel larger than a cargo pod. Our battle computers tracked thousands of objects moving through the system. And yet, somehow, 1.2 million human civilians simply vanished." The holographic display shifted, showing sensor logs from the Zephyrian fleet. Thousands of small contacts moved through the system, cargo haulers, mining vessels, maintenance shuttles, even garbage scows, all following predictable civilian trajectories. We detected no large-scale evacuation ships, no military transports, no obvious signs of organized withdrawal. Just normal commercial traffic continuing as if nothing had changed. Our intelligence officers dismissed the evacuation reports as human propaganda, designed to make us waste resources searching empty facilities. Kethfor's voice grew hollow. When our ground forces finally landed on Kepler 442b, they found exactly what our sensors had predicted: empty cities, abandoned infrastructure, no signs of recent habitation. The humans had apparently fled in panic, leaving behind valuable equipment and supplies. It appeared to be a complete victory. The commander paused, allowing the cadets to absorb this information. Then his mandibles clicked in what could only be described as admiration mixed with horror. 3 days later, we discovered the truth. Every single piece of abandoned infrastructure had been rigged with explosives. The humans hadn't fled in panic. They had orchestrated the most complex deception in recorded military history. The holographic display showed the aftermath. Massive explosions rippling across the planet's surface, taking out Zephyrian landing zones, supply depots, and command centers simultaneously. In a coordinated strike lasting less than 10 minutes, the humans destroyed 6 months' worth of our occupation infrastructure. But that wasn't the worst part. Kethfor manipulated the display again, showing space around the planet. Remember those thousands of civilian vessels we had been tracking? The cargo haulers, mining ships, maintenance craft? At the exact moment the surface explosions began, every single one of them revealed its true nature. The hologram came alive with weapons fire as seemingly innocent civilian craft shed their disguises, revealing hidden missile batteries, torpedo launchers, and boarding pods. They had been surrounding us for days, moving openly through our formations while we dismissed them as harmless. Each vessel carried a small crew of volunteers and enough firepower to cripple a cruiser. The cadets watched in stunned silence as the tactical display showed Zephyrian capital ships, protected by multiple layers of escorts and defensive screens, suddenly taking fire from inside their own formations. Ships that had been cleared by security screenings hours earlier were launching devastating close-range attacks. The humans call this tactic Trojan Horse, Kethfor explained, named after an ancient military deception from their homeworld. They had spent months converting civilian vessels, creating false transponder codes, and training skeleton crews for what amounted to suicide missions. Every ship that participated in the deception was destroyed within minutes of revealing itself, but the damage they inflicted was catastrophic. A young cadet, her voice trembling with disbelief, asked, "But why would civilians volunteer for certain death?" Kethfor's eyes fixed on her with something approaching pity. "That, young one, is perhaps the most disturbing thing about humans. They don't view individual survival as the highest priority. They have concepts, freedom, honor, protection of their young, that they value more than their own lives. This makes them unpredictable in ways our psychological profiles never anticipated." The commander's voice grew distant again. "In that single engagement, we lost 43 ships and over 200,000 personnel. The humans lost their planet, their infrastructure, and approximately 3,000 volunteers who chose to die so that 1.2 million civilians could escape. By any rational calculation, we had achieved strategic victory. But somehow, it felt like defeat." The holographic display faded, leaving the lecture hall in subdued lighting. The evacuation plan had been in development for months before we even arrived in the system. While our intelligence focused on their military capabilities, the humans were preparing to turn their entire civilization into a weapon. Every civilian craft, every commercial vessel, every piece of infrastructure was part of an integrated deception that made our technological superiority irrelevant. Kethfor looked across the sea of young faces, seeing his own confusion and fear reflected in their crystalline eyes. This was when I began to understand that we weren't fighting a conventional war. The humans didn't follow the rules of engagement that govern civilized warfare. They fought with the desperation of a species that believed extinction was preferable to surrender. And that desperation made them capable of things that still haunt my dreams. The commander moved to a different section of the holographic display, his movements betraying the weight of years and bitter memories. The new tactical readout showed a dense asteroid field with mining installations scattered throughout the rocky debris. By the second year of the conflict, our strategists believed they had identified human patterns. The deception at Kepler 442b was analyzed, catalogued, and countermeasures were developed. Our new detection protocols could identify disguised vessels. Our enhanced scanning could penetrate most camouflage, and our psychological profiles predicted human behavior with 78% accuracy. Kethfor's mandibles clicked, a sound that by now the cadets recognized as deeply troubling. The humans responded by abandoning patterns entirely. What I'm about to describe took place in the Vesta mining complex, a network of processing facilities built into 17 different asteroids. Intelligence suggested that a human cell was using the complex as a base for raiding our supply convoys. The display zoomed in on the asteroids, showing industrial installations, worker habitats, and the massive mining equipment that had carved valuable metals from the space rocks for over a century. Our plan was elegant in its simplicity. We would surround the complex with 3 battle groups, demand surrender, and systematically destroy any installation that showed resistance. The humans had perhaps 50 personnel in the entire complex. Workers, technicians, maybe a dozen actual combatants. A cadet interrupted. "Surely such a small force couldn't pose a significant threat to 3 battle groups?" "That's exactly what Fleet Admiral Zaxeni thought," Kethfor replied darkly. He deployed 127 ships in a perfect encirclement formation. Every escape route was covered, every possible hiding spot monitored. The humans were given 12 standard hours to surrender unconditionally. The holographic display showed the massive Zephyrian fleet arranged in a sphere around the mining complex, weapons trained on the installations. Everything appeared to be proceeding according to plan. The deadline passed without response. Admiral Zaxenii ordered the systematic destruction of the outer installations to demonstrate our resolve. The first asteroid mining station exploded exactly as expected. A brief flash of energy, scattered debris, no survivors. Kethfor paused, his eyes growing distant. The second asteroid exploded with the force of a stellar detonation. The blast vaporized 8 of our closest ships instantly and sent shockwaves through the entire formation. When the energy readings finally stabilized, our sensors detected something impossible. The explosion had been nuclear. The cadets shifted uncomfortably. Nuclear weapons were considered primitive and barbaric by galactic standards, too unpredictable and destructive for civilized warfare. Most species had abandoned them within centuries of their development. But that wasn't the worst revelation, Kethfor continued. Our analysis of the blast pattern revealed that the humans hadn't just rigged the asteroid with nuclear devices. They had turned the entire mining operation into a weapon. Decades of excavation had hollowed out the asteroid's interior, creating the perfect containment chamber for a fusion reaction. They had been planning this trap for years before we even knew the complex existed. The display shifted to show the aftermath. Twisted wreckage floating in space, the remaining asteroids in the complex suddenly looking far more ominous. Admiral Zaxenii faced an impossible choice: continue the attack and risk triggering more nuclear detonations, or withdraw and admit defeat to a handful of human miners. What did he choose? A cadet whispered. He chose to continue, Kethfor replied grimly. The fleet pulled back to extreme range and began systematic bombardment with long-range missiles. Each asteroid was targeted and destroyed from a safe distance. It should have been a clean, efficient operation. The holographic display showed missiles streaking toward their targets, impacting on asteroid surfaces, creating the expected explosions. But something was wrong with the pattern of destruction. The humans had anticipated this response too. They had spent months moving equipment, supplies, and personnel between asteroids through mining tunnels that connected the entire complex. When we destroyed what we thought were their positions, we were actually hitting decoy installations. Kethvor's voice grew quieter, forcing the cadets to strain to hear him. While we were systematically destroying empty rocks, the humans were using the confusion to launch their real attack. They had converted mining charges, industrial explosives used for asteroid excavation, into ship-killing weapons. But instead of launching them from the installations we were watching, they fired them from concealed positions throughout the asteroid field. The display erupted with new contacts, hundreds of small objects moving at high velocity toward the Zephyrian fleet. Mining charges aren't sophisticated weapons. They have no guidance systems, no electronic countermeasures, no defensive capabilities. They're just chunks of metal packed with explosives and fired in a straight line. Our point defense systems should have intercepted them easily. A cadet asked the obvious question, why didn't they? Because there were too many, Kethfor answered simply. The humans had fired over 3,000 mining charges simultaneously from positions throughout the asteroid field. Our defense computers couldn't process that many targets at once. Even if each defensive system performed perfectly, we could only intercept about 40% of the incoming projectiles. The holographic display showed the devastating results. Mining charges slamming into ship hulls, exploding against shields, overwhelming defensive systems through sheer volume. It was the most primitive, crude, inefficient attack I had ever witnessed. It should have been laughable. Instead, it crippled our fleet. Kethvor's carapace darkened further. 31 ships were destroyed or disabled. The humans lost their entire mining complex and all personnel, maybe 60 individuals total. By any strategic measure, we had achieved overwhelming victory. We controlled the battlefield, we had eliminated the threat, we had demonstrated superior firepower. The commander's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But as I watched the rescue operations, pulling survivors from the wreckage of our own ships, I realized something that changed my understanding of warfare forever. The humans hadn't been trying to win that battle. They had been trying to teach us that victory against them would always come at a price we couldn't afford to pay repeatedly. The lecture hall was silent except for the soft hum of life support systems. Every cadet was beginning to understand that they weren't hearing about a war in any conventional sense. They were learning about something far more disturbing, a conflict where the definitions of victory and defeat had been fundamentally altered. Kethvor stepped away from the holographic display, his 6 legs carrying him closer to the front rows of cadets. His scarred carapace caught the ambient light, each mark a testament to encounters that had tested everything he thought he knew about warfare. The asteroid incident forced our high command to reassess human capabilities. New protocols were developed, psychological profiles were updated, and our tacticians began studying human military history with unprecedented intensity. What they discovered was perhaps more disturbing than the battlefield encounters themselves. The commander activated a new section of the display, showing historical data streams and cultural analysis reports. Humans have been engaged in organized warfare for over 8,000 of their planetary years. In that time, they have developed more methods of killing each other than any species in recorded galactic history. Their creativity in destruction is matched only by their willingness to sacrifice everything for abstract concepts like freedom and honor. A young cadet in the front row raised a tentative claw. "Commander, surely their internal conflicts made them weaker? Species that fight among themselves typically lack the unity necessary for effective resistance against external threats." Kethvor's mandibles clicked in what might have been bitter amusement. That's what our xenopsychologists believe too. Human internal warfare should have fragmented their species, made them easy to conquer through divide-and-conquer strategies. Instead, their constant conflicts had created something we hadn't anticipated. A species where every individual was, by necessity, a potential soldier. The display shifted to show human population centers, educational systems, and social structures. Unlike civilized species that maintain professional military castes, humans had integrated warfare into their entire culture. Their entertainment featured military conflicts, their children played war games, their literature celebrated warriors and sacrifice. We weren't facing a conventional military force. We were fighting an entire species that had spent millennia preparing for war. Kethvor moved to a new section of the holographic display, showing a detailed star map of human-controlled space. This reality became clear during the Procyon campaign. Our intelligence had identified what appeared to be a critical weakness in human defenses. A lightly defended research station orbiting Procyon B. The facility was studying exotic matter physics, research that could potentially give them a technological advantage. The display zoomed in on the research station, a small installation with minimal defensive capabilities and a skeleton crew of scientists and technicians. Fleet Command assigned me to lead a surgical strike. 12 ships, in and out quickly, capture the research data and personnel without significant losses. It should have been routine. The commander's voice grew heavy with memory. When we arrived at Procyon B, the research station was exactly where intelligence predicted. Minimal defenses, no military escort, completely vulnerable to attack. Our scans detected 43 humans aboard the facility, researchers, support staff, maybe a few security personnel. I ordered the standard surrender demand. Kethvor paused, his eyes reflecting the pain of recollection. The humans responded with a single message: "Come and take it." 3 words that somehow conveyed more defiance than the longest military speeches from other species. The holographic display showed the Zephyrian ships approaching the station, weapons powered but not yet firing. I intended to disable their communications and life support systems, forcing a quick surrender. But as our ships moved into attack formation, something unprecedented happened. The research station began broadcasting on every available frequency, not to us, but to human settlements throughout the sector. The display filled with communication streams, thousands of messages flowing between the research station and distant human colonies. They were transmitting everything: their research data, personal messages to family members, tactical information about our fleet composition. But most significantly, they were broadcasting their intention to fight to the death rather than surrender. A cadet interrupted. "Surely this gave away their position to our intelligence services?" "That was exactly the point. Kethfor replied. Within minutes of beginning the transmission, we detected 17 human ships converging on our position from different vectors. Not military vessels, civilian craft, cargo haulers, even a passenger liner. All had changed course to come to the aid of the research station. The commander's voice grew quiet with something approaching awe. These weren't coordinated military responses. There was no central command authorizing these ships to abandon their original missions. Individual human captains, hearing the distress calls, had made personal decisions to engage a superior Zephyrian force. They came knowing they would die, but unable to ignore the call for help. The holographic display showed the approaching civilian ships, their improvised weapons and hastily constructed defenses clearly visible to Zephyrian sensors. I faced a tactical nightmare. Our original mission was surgical extraction of research data. Now we were looking at a running battle against dozens of improvised enemy vessels, with more arriving every hour. Kethfor activated a new section of the display, showing the chaotic battle that followed. The first civilian ship to arrive was a grain freighter called the Prairie Wind. It had no military weapons, no armor, no defensive systems beyond basic navigation shields. The captain, a female named Sarah Chun, announced her intention to ram our command ship. The cadets watched in horrified fascination as the tactical display showed the grain freighter accelerating toward the much larger Zephyrian cruiser. Standard point defense systems could have vaporized the Prairie Wind in seconds. But Captain Chun had done something we hadn't anticipated. She had vented her cargo holds, creating a cloud of grain particles around her ship. When our energy weapons fired, the organic matter absorbed and scattered the beams, reducing their effectiveness. The display showed the freighter impacting the Zephyrian ship's hull, the explosion taking out primary sensor arrays and damaging the navigation systems. Captain Chun died in the collision, along with her crew of 8 volunteers. But her sacrifice disabled our command vessel and threw our formation into chaos. Kethfor's voice grew hollow. That was just the beginning. Each civilian ship that arrived brought new innovations, new improvised weapons, new tactics that our battle computers couldn't predict. A passenger liner converted its recycling system into a projectile launcher. A mining vessel used its processing equipment to create crude but effective missiles. A medical transport turned its emergency beacon into a jamming device that disrupted our communications. The commander looked across the lecture hall, seeing the growing horror in the young faces before him. By the time the engagement ended, we had lost 6 ships and retreated from the system. The humans lost 19 vessels and over 500 lives. The research station they were protecting had been destroyed in the first minutes of the battle, its data transmitted to safety before our arrival. Kethfor's final words echoed through the silent chamber. They had won a strategic victory by losing everything they set out to defend, and we began to understand that facing humanity meant confronting a species that could turn any defeat into a weapon against us. Kethfor's final words echoed through the silent chamber. They had won a strategic victory by losing everything they set out to defend, and we began to understand that facing humanity meant confronting a species that could turn any defeat into a weapon against us. The commander moved away from the holographic display, his scarred form casting long shadows across the lecture hall. The cadets sat in stunned silence, their understanding of warfare fundamentally shaken by the accounts they had heard. But Kethfor's expression suggested that the worst revelations were yet to come. By the 4th year of the conflict, our casualties had reached unsustainable levels, not from massive battles or decisive defeats, but from constant attrition. Every engagement with humans, regardless of the tactical outcome, cost us ships, personnel, and resources we couldn't replace quickly enough. High Command finally authorized the use of our most advanced weapon systems. The holographic display activated again, showing technical schematics of Zephyrian superweapons, planet-cracking devices that could shatter worlds, stellar manipulators that could destabilize entire star systems, biological weapons capable of sterilizing all life from inhabited planets. The decision was made to end human resistance through overwhelming demonstration of power. We would select one of their major colony worlds and destroy it completely, showing the futility of continued resistance. The chosen target was New Harmony, an agricultural world with 2.8 million inhabitants and minimal military defenses. Kethvor's voice grew heavy with an emotion the cadets couldn't quite identify. I was assigned to the weapon deployment fleet, 30 ships carrying a quantum disruptor capable of tearing apart the molecular bonds holding the planet together. The humans would have 48 hours to evacuate before the weapon fired. It was intended as an act of mercy, allowing civilian populations to escape before the demonstration. The display showed the fleet positioning itself around New Harmony, the massive weapon platform beginning its charging sequence. Human ships did arrive within hours, hundreds of them, from every corner of their territory. But they didn't come to evacuate the population. They came to attack our fleet. Cadet raised a trembling claw. But surely they understood that nothing could stop a quantum disruptor once the charging sequence began? They understood perfectly, Kethvor replied grimly. Their plan wasn't to stop the weapon. It was to ensure that firing it would cost us everything we had gained in 4 years of warfare. What happened next still defies every principle of military logic I was taught. The holographic display erupted with activity as hundreds of human vessels swarmed toward the Zephyrian formation. But instead of the chaotic civilian responses they had witnessed before, this was coordinated military precision on a scale that seemed impossible for their species. Every human ship in that fleet was loaded with refugees from New Harmony, Kethvor continued. But instead of fleeing to safety, they had organized the evacuation as an attack formation. Civilian vessels, military ships, even pleasure craft had been converted into weapons platforms. The 2.8 million inhabitants weren't running from the threat. They were turning themselves into the ultimate weapon against us. The commander's voice grew hollow as he described the unfolding nightmare. The human plan was elegantly simple and absolutely terrifying. If we fired the quantum disruptor, we would destroy not just the planet, but hundreds of ships carrying refugees. The galactic community would see us as genocidal monsters, destroying civilians who were actively trying to escape. If we didn't fire, we would face the largest human fleet ever assembled, all of them fighting with the desperation of people defending their homes. The display showed the impossible dilemma playing out in real time. Zephyrian ships caught between moral horror and tactical necessity. Human vessels pressing their attack while broadcasting images of families, children, elderly beings who had chosen to fight rather than flee. But the humans had prepared a third option, Kethvor said quietly. As their ships engaged our fleet, we discovered that many of the refugee vessels were carrying more than just evacuees. They had loaded their cargo holds with antimatter, not as weapons but as insurance. If the quantum disruptor fired, the antimatter explosions would create a chain reaction that would tear apart spacetime in a radius of several light-years. The cadets recoiled in horror. The casual mention of weapons capable of destroying star systems was beyond their comprehension. They were prepared to commit suicide on a galactic scale? One whispered. No, Kethvor corrected. They were prepared to ensure that if their world died, we would die with them. The antimatter wasn't intended as an attack. It was meant to guarantee mutual destruction. They had calculated that the quantum disruptor blast, combined with hundreds of antimatter explosions, would create a spatial anomaly that would destroy both fleets and render the entire system uninhabitable for thousands of years. The commander's mandibles clicked in remembered terror. Fleet Admiral Zaxenii faced an impossible choice. Fire the weapon and trigger a catastrophe that would be visible from half the galaxy, or engage in a fleet battle against desperate humans who had nothing left to lose. In the end, he chose the battle. The holographic display showed the largest space engagement of the war, 30 Zephyrian capital ships against 847 human vessels of every description. The battle lasted 18 hours. When it was over, 19 of our ships were destroyed or crippled. The humans lost 731 vessels and over 400,000 lives. By any measure, it was a devastating defeat for humanity. Kethvor paused, his eyes reflecting the weight of terrible knowledge. But they had achieved their real objective. The quantum disruptor was damaged in the battle, its firing sequence interrupted. New Harmony remained intact, its population evacuated to safety aboard the surviving ships. Most importantly, they had demonstrated something that shook our empire to its core. The commander's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. They had shown that there was no weapon we could deploy, no threat we could make, No level of destruction we could promise that would make them surrender. Every escalation on our part was met with willingness to accept even greater casualties. They fought as if they truly believed that death was preferable to defeat. The lecture hall remained silent, the young cadets struggling to process the implications of what they were hearing. This wasn't just military history, it was a fundamental challenge to everything their civilization believed about rational behavior and acceptable costs. After New Harmony, our casualty projections became impossible to ignore, Keth4 continued. Complete victory over humanity would require the destruction of our entire fleet, the expenditure of our treasury, and the sacrifice of a generation of our finest warriors. Even then, success was not guaranteed. The humans had demonstrated repeatedly that they could turn any defeat into a strategic victory through sheer willingness to accept losses. The commander looked across the sea of young faces, seeing his own confusion and fear reflected in their crystalline eyes. That's when I began to understand the most disturbing truth about the human wars. We hadn't been defeated by superior technology or brilliant strategy. We had been defeated by encountering a species that was willing to pay prices for victory that we couldn't even comprehend. Keth4 moved to the center of the lecture hall, abandoning the holographic displays. The scars on his carapace seemed more pronounced in the subdued lighting, each mark telling a story of encounters that had fundamentally altered his understanding of what warfare could become. The final engagement I will describe to you took place in Earth's own solar system, he began, his voice carrying the weight of memories that had haunted him for decades. By the 6th year of the conflict, both sides were exhausted. Our fleets were reduced to less than 40% of their original strength. Human colonies had been devastated, their military infrastructure crippled. Any rational species would have sought negotiated peace. The commander's mandibles clicked in what the cadets now recognized as a sound of deep unease. Instead, the humans launched what they called Operation Prometheus, a final assault on the Zephyrian home fleet positioned at the edge of their solar system. Intelligence suggested they had fewer than 200 operational ships remaining. We had over 400 vessels, including our newest dreadnoughts and the rebuilt quantum disruptor platform. Keth4 paused, his 6 eyes reflecting the ambient light as he recalled details that still seemed impossible. The human fleet that emerged from behind Earth's moon was unlike anything we had encountered before. These weren't the improvised civilian conversions or hastily modified cargo haulers we had grown accustomed to fighting. These were purpose-built warships, constructed with 4 years of hard-won experience about how to fight Zephyrians. The commander began pacing, his movements betraying an agitation that years had failed to diminish. But the ships themselves weren't what made Operation Prometheus so devastating. It was the crews. Every human vessel was staffed entirely by volunteers, not professional soldiers, but civilians who had lost family members in previous engagements. Teachers, farmers, engineers, artists. People who had no military training but possessed something far more dangerous: absolute commitment to revenge. One of the cadets, her voice barely above a whisper, asked, "How could untrained civilians operate complex warships?" "Because they weren't operating them in any traditional sense," Keth4 replied grimly. The humans had developed a new tactical doctrine based on their analysis of our engagement patterns. They called it Kamikaze Protocol, named after an ancient human military tradition involving deliberate sacrifice for strategic gain. The commander's voice grew hollow as he continued. Each human ship in that final fleet was designed for a single purpose: to get close enough to a Zephyrian vessel to inflict maximum damage before being destroyed. They had stripped out life support systems, defensive arrays, even basic navigation equipment. Everything was sacrificed to pack more explosives, more weapons, more destructive potential into hulls that were never intended to return home. The lecture hall was completely silent now, the earlier excitement replaced by growing horror at the implications of what they were hearing. These young cadets had been raised in a culture that viewed the preservation of life as the highest military virtue. The idea of deliberately designing ships for suicide missions was alien to their thinking. The battle began normally enough, Keth4 continued. Our fleet maintained proper formation, targeting the approaching human vessels with long-range weapons. Our tactical computers calculated that we could destroy 60% of their ships before they reached effective combat range. It should have been a massacre in our favor. The commander's eyes grew distant, lost in memories of that final catastrophic engagement. But the humans had learned something from 6 years of warfare that our computers couldn't process. They understood that mathematical probability became irrelevant when dealing with crews who had already accepted death as inevitable. Every human ship that survived our initial barrage used that survival not to retreat or seek defensive positions, but to accelerate toward our heaviest units. Kethvor's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing the cadets to lean forward to hear him. I watched a human destroyer, barely 200 meters long, ram itself into the side of our flagship, the Eternal Dominion. The explosion tore a 50-meter hole in our primary hull. Before damage control could respond, a second human ship had targeted the exact same breach, flying directly into the wound created by the first. The commander paused, his mandibles clicking rapidly. That's when I realized that the human kamikaze attacks weren't random acts of desperation. They were coordinated precision strikes, with each subsequent ship targeting the damage created by the previous one. They had turned suicide into a surgical weapon. A young cadet, his voice shaking with disbelief, asked, "But surely your point defense systems could have prevented such close-range attacks?" "Under normal circumstances, yes," Kethvor replied. But the humans had spent years studying our defensive patterns. They knew exactly how our automated systems would respond to incoming threats. So they developed a countermeasure that was both brilliant and absolutely terrifying. The commander's voice grew heavy with remembered horror. Each wave of attacking ships was accompanied by what they called chaff vessels, hulks packed with metallic debris, electronic countermeasures, and decoy systems. These ships would explode at precisely calculated distances from our fleet, creating clouds of interference that blinded our sensors and overwhelmed our targeting computers. Kethvor began pacing again, his movements betraying the deep psychological scars left by that final battle. But the chaff wasn't just defensive. The humans had calculated the exact electromagnetic signatures created by our weapon systems when they fired. The metallic debris in their chaff clouds was designed to absorb and redirect our energy weapons, turning our own firepower against us. The cadets exchanged horrified glances as the implications became clear. The humans hadn't just learned to defend against Zephyrian weapons, they had learned to turn those weapons into additional sources of destruction. The final phase of Operation Prometheus was something that still defies my understanding, Kethvor continued. As our fleet formation collapsed under the kamikaze attacks, the surviving human ships began broadcasting on all frequencies. Not military communications or tactical updates, but personal messages from the crews to their families back on Earth. The commander's voice broke slightly as he recalled what he had witnessed. I listened to farmers saying goodbye to their children, teachers recording final lessons for their students, engineers explaining technical problems to colleagues they would never see again. They were dying by the thousands, but their final thoughts weren't of revenge or hatred. They were of love for the people they were trying to protect. Kethvor stopped pacing and faced the cadets directly. That's when I understood the most fundamental difference between our species and theirs. We fight to preserve our civilization, our way of life, our technological achievements. Humans fight to preserve something far more abstract and infinitely more powerful, their capacity to choose death over surrender. The commander's voice grew quiet with something approaching awe. The battle lasted 14 hours. When it ended, 847 human ships had been destroyed with all hands. We lost 312 vessels and over 400,000 personnel. By any strategic measure, we had achieved tactical victory. But as I watched the debris of both fleets drifting through Earth's solar system, I realized that we had actually lost the war. A cadet in the front row asked the question that was haunting all of them. How could such massive losses constitute victory for the humans? Because they had accomplished something that changed the fundamental equation of the conflict, Kethvor replied. They had demonstrated that every victory we achieved would cost us more than we could afford to pay repeatedly. The human casualties in Operation Prometheus were volunteers who had chosen their fate. Our losses were professional soldiers, trained officers, irreplaceable technical specialists, the core of our military capability. The commander moved closer to his audience, his scarred form casting imposing shadows. More importantly, they had shown the galaxy that the mighty Zephyrian Empire could be fought to a standstill by a single species armed with nothing but determination and willingness to sacrifice everything for their beliefs. Within months of Operation Prometheus, 3 other species had begun organizing resistance movements. The humans had given the galaxy a template for defeating technological superiority through sheer force of will. Kethvor's voice grew heavy with the weight of final revelation. 6 months after the battle, our High Command received a communication from Earth. Not a surrender offer or peace negotiation, but a simple message that contained the most chilling words I have ever heard. We are prepared to continue this war for as long as necessary. Each engagement will cost you more than you can afford. Each victory will bring you closer to defeat. We have already accepted the price of our freedom. The question is, are you prepared to pay the price of our enslavement? The lecture hall fell into complete silence. Every cadet was struggling to process the implications of what they had heard. The idea that a technologically inferior species could achieve strategic victory through willingness to accept catastrophic losses challenged everything they had been taught about warfare, civilization, and rational behavior. The armistice was signed 8 months later, Kethvor concluded quietly. Not because we couldn't continue fighting, but because our computer models showed that complete victory over humanity would require the destruction of our entire military, the bankruptcy of our treasury, and the sacrifice of an entire generation of our finest warriors. Even then, success was not guaranteed. The commander looked across the sea of young faces, seeing his own confusion and fear reflected in their crystalline eyes. The human wars ended not with conquest or surrender, but with mutual recognition of an unacceptable truth. We had encountered a species that could not be defeated through conventional means because they had redefined what defeat meant. They fought not to preserve their civilization, but to ensure that destroying it would cost more than any rational attacker could afford to pay. Kethvor moved toward the exit, his presentation complete. But he paused at the threshold and turned back to face the cadets one final time. You came here expecting to learn about human tactical innovations, weapons technology, or strategic doctrines. Instead, you have learned something far more important and infinitely more disturbing. You have learned that there are species in this galaxy that value abstract concepts like freedom and dignity more than their own survival, and that makes them the most dangerous opponents any civilized race could ever face. The commander's final words echoed through the silent chamber as he departed. The next time you encounter humanity, in trade, diplomacy, or any other context, remember what you have heard today. They are not a species that can be threatened, coerced, or intimidated. They are a species that has demonstrated repeatedly their willingness to turn any interaction into a weapon if they believe their core values are threatened. Treat them with the respect such capability demands, because the alternative is a conflict where victory and defeat become meaningless concepts, and survival itself becomes a luxury neither side can afford. The lecture hall remained silent long after Kethvor had departed, the young cadets struggling to process revelations that had fundamentally altered their understanding of warfare, civilization, and the nature of rational behavior in an irrational universe. 3 standard hours after the lecture had ended, the hall was still occupied. Most of the cadets had remained in their seats, staring at the now-dark holographic display where they had witnessed the tactical breakdowns of their empire's greatest military failures. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional click of mandibles or the soft scrape of claws against metal as someone shifted uncomfortably. Cadet Lixturn was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think he was telling the truth? About all of it?" Her question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The other cadets turned toward her, their crystalline eyes reflecting doubt, fear, and something approaching trauma. These young beings had entered the hall expecting to hear tales of Zephyrian military superiority. Instead, they had been confronted with accounts that challenged everything they believed about their species' place in the galaxy. "The records are public," replied Cadet Vexnall, his voice hollow. "I accessed the military archives during the break. Every battle he described is documented. Every casualty figure he quoted is accurate. The only difference is that the official reports call them strategic victories and successful resource denial operations. Another cadet, Zeth Cole, struggled to find words for the emotions churning within her. But how can beings choose to die for ideas, for concepts that have no physical reality? It's not rational. It's not civilized. That's exactly the point, said Lixtern, her understanding growing as she spoke. Commander Kethvor wasn't describing rational opponents. He was describing something far more dangerous, beings who operate outside the framework of logical cost-benefit analysis. The cadets fell silent again, each lost in private contemplation of what they had learned. Their military training had taught them to assess threats based on technological capability, numerical strength, and strategic resources. The humans had possessed none of these advantages, yet had somehow achieved strategic victory through methods that defied all conventional wisdom. "I keep thinking about the mining charges," whispered Cadet Yalrex. "Thousands of primitive explosives fired in straight lines with no guidance systems. It should have been laughable. Instead, it crippled an entire fleet because there were simply too many to stop." "Quality versus quantity," mused Vexnall. "We've always assumed that superior technology trumps inferior numbers. But the humans found the breaking point, the threshold where even perfect defensive systems become overwhelmed by sheer volume." Zethkol's voice carried a note of growing horror. "It's worse than that. They didn't just find our breaking point. They were willing to sacrifice thousands of their own people to exploit it. How do you fight an enemy that treats its own casualties as acceptable losses for marginal tactical gains?" The question hung unanswered because none of them had an answer. Their entire educational system had been built around the principle that rational beings sought to minimize losses while maximizing gains. The idea of deliberately accepting catastrophic casualties for abstract principles was alien to their thinking. "The evacuation at Kepler 442b, said Lixtern slowly. 1.2 million civilians disappearing in 72 hours. Even knowing the method, I can't understand the logistics. How do you coordinate that many people, that many vessels, that many deception protocols without someone making a mistake? Because every individual understood their role and accepted the consequences," replied a new voice from the entrance. The cadets turned to see Commander Kethvor himself standing in the doorway, his scarred form silhouetted against the corridor lighting. The young beings immediately began to rise in formal salute, but Kethvor gestured for them to remain seated. He moved slowly into the hall, his 6 legs carrying him toward the group with measured steps. "You stayed to discuss what you heard," he observed. "Good. That means you understand the importance of what I shared with you." Cadet Vexnall found the courage to ask the question that had been haunting him. "Commander, how do we defend against an enemy like that? How do we prepare for opponents who don't follow rational strategic principles?" Kethvor's mandibles clicked in what might have been approval. "By accepting that our definitions of rationality may be incomplete. The humans weren't irrational, they were operating under a completely different value system. Understanding that difference is the key to avoiding future conflicts." The commander moved to the holographic display controls, activating a new image, current diplomatic exchanges between the Zephyrian Empire and human colonies. "The armistice has held for 35 years because both sides learned valuable lessons from the war. We learned that military superiority doesn't guarantee victory against opponents willing to pay unlimited prices. They learned that their willingness to sacrifice everything could be channeled into peaceful pursuits that achieved their goals without catastrophic losses." Zethkol asked quietly, "Do you think they would fight the same way if threatened again?" "Without question," Kethvor replied immediately. "Human nature hasn't changed. They still value their abstract concepts more than their individual lives. But they've also learned that those concepts can be protected through means other than warfare. Trade, diplomacy, cultural exchange, these have given them security without the costs of military resistance." The commander's voice grew thoughtful. "In some ways, the peace has been more educational than the war. Watching humans build, create, and explore has shown us aspects of their character that combat never revealed. They are capable of remarkable achievements when their energies are directed toward construction rather than destruction. Lixtern ventured another question. Commander, do you think other species might develop similar capabilities? The willingness to sacrifice everything for abstract principles. Kethvor considered this carefully before responding. Any species can develop such characteristics under sufficient pressure. What made humans unique was that they had already developed them before we encountered them. Their history of internal conflicts had prepared them for external threats in ways we never anticipated. The commander's eyes grew distant as he accessed memories from the post-war period. I've spent decades studying human culture, trying to understand what created such fierce dedication to abstract concepts. Their literature, their art, their philosophy, all of it reinforces the idea that some things are worth dying for. They call it honor, freedom, dignity. Words that have no direct translation in our language because we lack the cultural framework to understand them. Is that a weakness in our culture? Asked Vexnall. Different, not necessarily weaker, Kethvor replied. Our emphasis on preservation and rational calculation has given us technological advancement and stable civilization. But it also left us unprepared for opponents who prioritized other values. The key is recognizing that different approaches to existence can coexist without necessarily conflicting. The commander activated another section of the display, showing current human settlements throughout their territory. What you see here represents the positive aspects of human determination. The same species that fought us to a standstill has terraformed hostile worlds, established trade networks across hundreds of light years, and developed technologies that complement rather than compete with our own. Cadet Yalrex asked, "Do you think the war was inevitable? Could diplomacy have prevented it?" Kethvor's mandibles clicked slowly as he considered the question. Perhaps, but it would have required us to approach humans as equals rather than primitives to be pacified. Our initial assumption of superiority made conflict inevitable. The humans simply responded to aggression in the only way their culture permitted: total resistance. The commander's voice carried a note of hard-won wisdom. The greatest lesson of the human wars isn't about military tactics or weapons technology. It's about the danger of assumptions. We assumed that technological advancement indicated cultural superiority. We assumed that rational calculation would always triumph over emotional responses. We assumed that all intelligent species would prioritize survival over abstract principles. All of those assumptions were wrong, whispered Zethkol. Not wrong, Kethvor corrected. Incomplete. They applied to most species we had encountered, but not to all possible forms of intelligence. The humans taught us that diversity of thought and values is not a weakness to be corrected, but a strength to be respected. The commander moved toward the exit again, but paused for one final observation. You are the generation that will inherit the peace we built on the foundation of that terrible war. Remember what you learned today. Remember that strength comes in many forms, and that true victory often means choosing not to fight at all. As Kethvor departed for the second time, the cadets remained in contemplative silence. They had come to the lecture expecting entertainment and left with a fundamental shift in their understanding of the universe. The galaxy was far more complex and dangerous than they had imagined, populated by species whose capabilities couldn't be measured by conventional standards. The lessons of the human wars would stay with them throughout their careers, a constant reminder that in a universe full of unknown variables, humility might be the most valuable tactical asset of all. #Veteran Alien Commander shares chilling stories of human tactics.